Hello, my name is Elliot Stewart, and I do an awful lot of interviews with rather famous folk. And today I've got a doozy, Steve Nallon, who for a whole generation, particularly when I was a teenager, used to scare me silly, being Margaret Thatcher and lots of others on Spitting Image. He's also got a new sci-fi time travel book out, which I'm looking forward to having a little chit chat about. And hello, Steve, how are you doing there?
Hello. Yes. 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 It never occurred to me that I would be a frightening character as Thatcher. But I suppose if you were 8 or 10 or even 12, 14, I don't know, I suppose the Thatcher puppet would have been a bit terrifying. So, and
Yeah.
that never occurred to me till recently when I've been chatting to people of as it were, a younger generation that used to watch Spitting Image behind the sofa because it was so weird. So that's an interesting perspective. Yeah.
Well, I met Gordon Kennedy, the Scottish comedian, and also Julian Glover, and I told them that they had scared me at various times. And they said, but it's comedy. I said, yeah, but comedy can be very persuasive. And seeing, well, I know you did other voices as well on Spitting Image. I mean, obviously, Margaret Thatcher, we always think about, and you've done lots of appearances as her over the years. I researched to see you did stuff on TV which gave me such a flashback. And I was like, the look on Rusty Lee's face when you emerge in character, she's in hysterics.
Yeah, we made a cabinet pudding, I think. I think that's one of the things that I really, in fact, I think that's probably one of my earliest appearances dressed up as Mrs. Thatcher on television. The outfit came from a theatre show I'd done at Theatre Clwyd in 1983, and they gave me the outfit because I said, I'd like to, continue dressing up occasionally. And that was actually before Spitting Image came along. So I was actually dressing up as Thatcher well before Spitting Image. So, yeah.
So when you, for want of a better phrase, auditioned, if people knew that you could already do the voice, did they say, would you like to, this is like the Muppets, but for grown-ups? Or were you keen?
I did send the review because we got reviewed in whatever newspaper it was, and of the play, which is called The Cloggies, which was based on a Bill Tidy cartoon at Theatre Clwyd in Mold, and it went down legendary as one of the worst shows that they had ever made.
Oh dear!
And people were fired and walked out, and legal threats and all sorts of stuff was going on backstage. And I returned to Theatre Clwyd about 10 years later, and people were almost queuing up, not to meet me, but to ask whether or not The Cloggies was as bad as everybody said it was. And it probably was, really. It was a complete disaster. And anyway, but I did get mentioned in one of the reviews, so I sent this to John Lloyd. Because I read about Spitting Image as an idea for a new show on television, caricature puppets, politicians, and he agreed to meet me as a joke because he thought it would make a good bar story. Because I was 23, 20, maybe 20, yeah, just 23, and he thought, I got this letter from this lad who done a ridiculously stupid show in wherever, and he thinks he can be Margaret Thatcher. So he met me, and years later, he said to me that the only reason why he met me, apart from the bar story that I would make in later, was his BBC training. And he said BBC training said you must be open to every single possibility, no matter how stupid it is.
Yes.
Because sometimes one of those one in 1,000 stupid ideas will work. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't know that the BBC work like that anymore, but the idea that that you had to be open to every single possibility, and so I met him at Central Television in Birmingham, and I got through the door because the receptionist thought I was John Lloyd. I had a letter from John Lloyd, and she thought I was John Lloyd, and I was a bit calculating, and I still am sometimes, and I realized that if I got inside the building, it would be much more difficult for them to get rid of me. Because if I did the audition in the reception area, then, there'd be people coming in and out. I'd be more nervous. But if I could get inside the building and in a room, they're stuck with me then. So I let the lady on reception believe I was John Lloyd, and I got into the building. The guy then meeting John Lloyd didn't know who I was, and I said, it was called Brian. I had to explain he was the designer, and we got on quite well. And then I met John Lloyd in the designer's office, and I think John Lloyd thought I was the designer. It was all like a French farce.
Yes.
Anyway, I did the thing. And John said, what do you want to do? An audition. I said, well, you ask me a question and I'll answer it as Mrs. Thatcher. So he did. I can't remember what the question was, but I answered it as Mrs. Thatcher. And goodness me, I think he was rather taken aback by this experience, this rather strange moment when I became the then Prime Minister. And then Roger Law turned up, because it was a big meeting. It was a big sort of production meeting going on. Roger Law turned up, wanted to know who I was. And Roger said, oh, you're Mrs. Thatcher, are you? So he said, we'll do her. I said, I do not take instructions from men. And he burst out laughing, and he loved it. He just then, Roger, who rang me up the other day, and he was very proud because they'd had an exhibition at Cambridge that had got 40,000 people gone to see it. And so he was really excited. He rang me up and told me that. So we stayed friends ever since. And he was probably the reason I got the job, because he found it funny, that the idea of a guy doing Mrs. Thatcher, he thought it was the funniest thing in the world. So that's sort of how I got the job.
And it's amazing, because I say that's the thing, even without all the puppetry and everything, you become the character. Now, this is I'm going to say, have you ever met her? Did you ever meet her?
No, she came to Limehouse Studios, which is above which was where the Spitting Image puppets were made. So Limehouse Studios was one of the very early independent studios, and it's where they made a series called Who Dares Wins. Oh, yeah. And I think they made some game shows there. I can't remember now, but Spitting Image had the workshop above the studios, and Mrs. Thatcher came to Limehouse Studios because it was part of their enterprise zone. And in the 80s, you had these enterprise zones. And the thing about them was the normal rules you didn't have to keep to. And the reason why Spitting Image was there was because they didn't need extractor fans for the fumes that came as a result of making the puppets and the painting. Yeah. So, and as soon as they left the enterprise zone, they had to get in proper ventilation. But actually, I remember it very clearly. It was basically an old warehouse. It was an old banana warehouse. Yeah. And there was no health and safety whatsoever, because that was the nature of it. Anyway, she came to Limehouse, and I was there, and I was so tempted to go up to her, but she was surrounded by sort of security people and stuff. Dennis Thatcher, her husband, said hello to me. Hello. And I didn't know he didn't know who I was. And I suppose I don't have regrets, but I suppose it might have been interesting had I said, hello, Mrs. Thatcher. I'm you, but I never did, I never did that. There were moments like that. And I met, I don't know how X-rated your program is.
I can take out naughty words.
You can bleep out naughty words. Okay. But let me, you might have to anyways, I met a friend of mine worked for Andrew Lloyd Webber. Oh yes. So I went to meet him for lunch or something. I was at university with him, and Prince Edward was working there. And he introduced me. He said, "This is Steve and this is Edward." And one of the other characters I did on Spitting Image was the Queen Mother. I did her as Beryl Reid and Marlene. But actually, Mrs. Thatcher I never operated because she was too heavy. But the Queen Mother, when I was doing puppets, they allowed me to operate that particular puppet. Yeah. And I did at the time think I should have. When Edward said to me, "What do you do?" and I said, "Oh, I'm an actor." What I should have said was, "I fisk your grandmother."
Well, I'll let it fit of that.
And maybe
Ah,
you'll have to put a few bleeps on that.
okay.
But
The
so
temp-
because that's what you did. I mean, the puppets, you had to put your
yes.
underneath them and then
Yeah.
operate like that.
I
But
didn't know
you
you had
you
to do
you
that.
had to you
Yeah.
had to put you generally had to get your fist in first.
See, I always thought that yourself and Steve Coogan and Harry Enfield and all the people who did the voice, that they pre-recorded them and then they had to mime, but you had to.
No, that is true. What happened was because Harry and Steve all came later.
Ah, yes.
So in the very first series, because of the way Muppets had been made, Muppets had
Mhm.
been done, as live, and Louise Gold was a Muppeteer, and she basically trained us to be puppeteers. And the reason was that they thought that you wouldn't be able to get the way the Muppets worked because it was live. The voice and the puppets were live. That's how they made it. People move when they speak, and they have particular actions when they speak, and we would lose all that if it was pre-recorded.
Yeah.
So myself and Chris Barry
Oh, yes.
were trained up to be puppeteers. And some of the puppeteers, Louise did the voice of the Queen, for example, and several of the other puppeteers also operated and did the voices. It became impractical because it was impossible to do because of the noise, because of time, because of trying to get the voice right and stuff. But it was the first show was recorded in such a way that it was live in the studio in terms of voice and puppets coming together. And the week after, it was pre-recorded because that didn't work. And then later on, people like John Sessions and Harry Enfield and Steve Coogan joined. But they were never trained up to be puppeteers. But myself and Chris were, because they wanted, that's the way they wanted to work it. And I was very grateful for that, because I then learned a trade really as a puppeteer, which I went on to do after leaving Spitting Image, or when Spitting Image came to an end. So yeah, it was it was. And people forget about Spitting Image because it's 40 years old now. I mean, people forget it was a disaster. It really was. It didn't work. It wasn't funny. The first program brought in 8 million, and the next program brought in 2 million. In
Wow.
1 week, we'd lost 6 million viewers because there was a load of publicity for the show, and then the general thought was the puppets look great, but the jokes are unfunny, and nobody knows how to do this. And it wasn't true really, but so lots of people got fired. I mean, there was a lot of blood on the carpet. And what John did was bring in new writers such as Rob Grant and Doug Naylor. And what they did, they weren't really interested in politics, but they brought in characters. They brought in the football people, football players, pundits. They also brought in showbiz people. We had a very interesting, lovely guy called Errol, who was worked with the puppets that in against blacks, so that it was all rod operated, but it didn't suit the style. So he returned to America. He was a nice guy, but he returned to America, and the show took on a slightly different dimension. It became less political and much more of a mixture of showbiz people. So I was started doing Bruce Forsyth. So very early on, they did a Brucey. Of course, everybody did Brucey, but
Yes.
but we had fun with the hair, which none of the other.
Yes.
So people just did Brucey, but we would really, we said, look, he wears a wig. Let's make fun of that. And then we did the same with Paul Daniels, and Chris Barry did a very good Paul Daniels. We did have a very funny sketch once, which I think was. Do you remember that in the 80s there was a program I think called One Man and His Dog or something, and it was about sheep dogs and how good they were at rounding up sheep. And we had Paul Daniels' wig became the thing rounding up all the sheep or something, running around. I think it was very funny.
Yeah.
And yeah, Paul Daniels got well annoyed about this and started attacking Spitting Image, saying it was terribly unfunny. And then we just had his wig going up and down and stuff. I got my comeuppance on that because I appeared on Pointless Celebrities, and people kept saying, one guy said, "Oh, look at Steve and what a ridiculous wig he's wearing." Actually, it is my own hair,
Yes.
but the haircut looked as if it was a wig. But anyway, so it was cheap. It was cheap gags. Somebody was bald wearing a wig. But that's what Spitting Image was. It really was a load of cheap gags, but nobody else had done those cheap gags before on television.
So that was very different because you had weekending as well, and I remember share this with you. My GCSE teacher or A level teacher, we watched Spitting Image. He said, "I'm going to show you some satire," but it really wasn't that. It was lots of funny jokes. There was one about Jonathan Miller being taken the mickey out, and it was just they're going to talk bollocks, and it was just
exactly
bollocks.
We loved all that, and it was called Talking Bollocks. That's with Jonathan Miller, and Bernard Levin, and all they did was talk about Ishmael and references to. What's that whale book? What was it called? I remember, the whale book, the American whale book thing. It'll come to us. Captain Ahab and the whale.
There we go. Moby Dick. I remember.
Moby Dick. Thank you.
Everybody.
He's got a penis in the title, and why didn't I remember it? But it was and so there was, and it was quite clever in a way because. It was all the references were to Moby Dick, and it was nonsense, but it was the sort of nonsense where you got those, over clever pundits on 11 o'clock at night on BBC Two. So the target range from the Paul Daniels to, Talking Bollocks with Bernard Levin and Jonathan Miller. So, and the people who watch the show tended to, it was a whole range of people, but it included those people such as Jonathan Miller and Bernard Levin, because although the show cost a huge amount of money from the period, the figures have gone up over the years because of people embellish stuff, but it was roughly about $250,000 per show, which is you could make 5 hours of television now for 250,000. But afternoon television, you could do that 50 grand a show. But this was now 40 years ago, and it was a huge amount of money for a half-hour show. But the point was, John said that the advertising revenue they got from it was about $500,000. So it was making a profit, and it was making a profit because Central could say to the advertisers, "You're going to get the A-B category of people. You're going to get the intellectuals watching it because they're going to love Bernard Levin and Jonathan Miller, taking the piss out of them for talking bollocks." And it had a whole range, and it was that, So when you looked at the adverts in between Spitting Image, it was for banks, it was for BMWs, it was for the high-end, high-spend, the category, and that's why it was a huge commercial success eventually when people started watching it. But it took the series, and also we're all over the schedule for some reason. But when we settled at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, and that became more or less permanent, that's when it sort of became, established. Occasionally it never did. There was a very famous thing for us on Spitting Image. They were still editing part 2 as part 1 was going out.
Wow.
On occasion, it was that close. And then there was another occasion when they rang up the snooker and said, "Could you extend the snooker for 20 minutes? We haven't finished the show yet." And then they did the film. No, I think Steve Davis has potted the black, and that's the end of it. So they said, "No, we're going to finish at 5 to 10, and that you get your program ready." But
that with have I got news for you? Drop the Dead Donkey, when they used to do that, and they used to write that right up to the broadcast thing. And the new live show version of that, apparently they will be rewriting it as it's to keep it topical, because the internet has made everything so immediate.
That's what it has, yeah.
Of Spitting Image for me, when I was a teenager was staying up to see everybody get roasted. It wasn't just Labour or the Conservatives or even the middle ground. Everybody was a target in different ways, which I really found the joy in that. I mean, what's interesting now is comedies. It's a little bit safe on television because I think people are worried about, oh, you know, if we have an advert and then that joke's too controversial, people won't buy our stuff anymore. And I think to have the fact that Spitting Image went, right, everybody's going to tune in, everybody is going to be not offended, but everybody is a viable target. And I love that with humour, that you should cover a whole ground so that we make people who are pompous look like idiots. You know?
Absolutely, and you said it was jokes earlier on, and I think that's right. Satire. John Lloyd hated the word satire because he never thought it. He understood what satire was, and he knew that. I said, "Well, how would you describe it?" And he said, "Steve, Spitting Image is basically to the rich and famous on a Sunday night." That's what it is. And I think he was right from that point of view. And occasionally we became a little bit satirical. In terms of offending people and being cruel, that was the point. You know, that came from the top. That came from Peter and Roger. And they wanted to offend, and they intentionally were cruel. And that's just that. There are lots of people who don't like sort of satirists because you know, they're always against things. But that's the point. That's what satire is. It's pointing at whoever it is and saying hypocrisy. You know, satirists don't produce anything in the sense that they, you know, produce great art in the, you know, great painting that you can look at and admire, and isn't it beautiful? That's not the point of what satirists do. Satirists are there to bring you down, to make fun of, as you said, the pompous, you know, the people who think they're higher up than they really are, and bring them down a bit. And that was the whole point of the show. And if they could be offensive at the same time and cruel I think cruel is interesting. I went up to John. You know, John was always interested in what new voices you've got, and I was very slow. I wasn't as quick as Chris Barry, who's particularly good at getting voices. But I went up to him one day and I said, "Well, John, I've been working on Little Alan Bennett, and I'm from Leeds, and you know, and I think I'm the only person who's ever attempted to do an impersonation of Alan Bennett, which turned out to be right, and nobody had done it. Somebody suggested that I do him, and I said, well, I'll have a go. And they said, oh, it's really good. Your Alan Bennett's really good. Yeah. Anyway, so he said, no, I'm not going to do Alan Bennett because I like him. I admire him. I think he's a great guy. And why would you want to make fun of him? Because and then Kate Robbins was there, and Kate said, well, I do a very good Thora Hird. Would you like to hear my Thora Hird? And then they had the idea of putting Alan and Thora together in little sketches, watching the sketches on Spitting Image.
That Gogglebox.
Exactly. Yeah. We were the first Gogglebox. Kate and I doing Alan and Thora. We were the first Gogglebox. And one of the directors said to me, he said, that's such a useful device in the show because it brings an element of academics would call it metatextuality, when the what you're watching becomes what you're watching. That you're watching, you know what I mean? There's a show within a show, and and Alan and Thora were able to make comments on the sketches, and they often lasted about 15 seconds, but they were just. And the director said to me, they're really useful because you've got these long sketches for, you know, maybe a minute and a half, and then your little 10 seconds of Alan and Thora, and it just breaks up the pattern and the rhythm, and so you're not watching, you know, 2 minutes followed by 2 minutes followed by 2 minutes or whatever, and so so that's why and they had little sketches in their own right, you know, and Jammy Dodger. We always had Alan Bennett eating a Jammy Dodger. I don't know why. I suppose it's seemed to be a working class Leeds, food or something. I'm not sure, but he was and he liked his character, and it was a nice, gentle character.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is when you do, we'll move on to an exciting time travel book in a minute. But when you like, obviously mocked Margaret Thatcher, it could be that you're not particularly fond of her, and
nobody was,
I can understand that. I wasn't, I was quite scared of her, as I've said. But there must be that thing of going, if you met Brucey or Alan, you go, oh, they're really nice people. Maybe we shouldn't be,
Well, here's the thing, because I worked with Mike Yarwood, and Mike knew everybody in showbiz, because a very popular man was Mike Yarwood.
Yeah.
And he was a nice guy, and everybody liked him, and he liked everybody else. So he used to get sketches coming in about Tarbuck and Bruce Forsyth, and he wouldn't do. Some of them are well liked, and some of them are not. But Gerald Kaufman was always voted shit of the year because nobody on either side of the political spectrum liked him. Don't know why, but and so Spitting Image got word of this, and they made him into Hannibal Lecter.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
I do.
And he was the deputy. No, he wasn't deputy. He was the Shadow Home Secretary. Yeah. And Roy Hattersley, Roy Hattersley, always the spitting, and they used to visit him in the cell, and we were chatting. There was Hugh Dennis who did the voice, I think, and so people would go in and do the sketches, and then but in the rest of the time we would sit in the green room and gossip. And so I remember having a chat to Hugh about adolescence when we were younger, and we had this guy at school who would come in and when we were sort of 13 or something, you needn't edit this out or bleep it, but he used to come in and he'd say have you had a milky discharge? Have you had a milky discharge? It's a horrible expression. Anyway, Hugh quite thought this was great funny. And he added it to Hannibal Lecter. Have you had a milky discharge? I think the sort of things like that. So
That's funny because
and that's
Hugh
how
had
it worked. That you
Milky
know,
Milky
we
was
could add our
mm,
own stuff occasionally
yeah.
into sketches, and there is a sketch somewhere where that lad from my school in Leeds who talked about milky discharge, somehow it ended up on Spitting Image. Well, via Hugh and
Yeah.
via me.
Well, Hugh had that. He had a catchphrase when I was a student of Milky Milky, which was about not about that, which was about a carton of milk going off on the radiator. So we were all saying Milky Milky back in the 90s and everything.
Well,
So
I'm glad that caught on and not milky
I
discharge.
was going to say, yes. So I mean, without sort of saying, once Spitting Image, I remember sort of mid 90s. I think it. What was you were like? I'm free. Once Margaret Thatcher passed away, as well, which is some time later. Did you feel free of her? I'm going to do other things now. I'm going to be a voice artist, or did you think, oh, I'll have a little bit more of a go at as being Mrs. Thatcher from beyond the grave, if you like?
I grew a beard.
Yes.
Because I wasn't invited to do Mrs. Thatcher anymore. My beard was never convincing, but I grew a beard because
Yeah.
I'd never been able to grow a beard before.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a very good beard, but people said cut it because it looks ridiculous. So I sort of planned it. I'd had a with Mike, working with Mike Yarwood was interesting because Mike said many things, but he said, look, because he asked me on his show to be myself on his show and come on in a bow tie and chat, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. And he said, you're very wise, Steve, actually you're very wise not to be recognized as yourself. He said, I would advise you to continue not to, as it were, come out as yourself. Oh, play the character, but don't come out as yourself.
Yeah.
And then he said, you know, it's interesting. When you're 25 and you impersonate somebody who's 50, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Mm.
When you're 50, you mustn't ever try and impersonate somebody who's 25 because that's sad, or words to that effect. He was then in his 50s and he was struggling to find characters to do because he knew he couldn't do people younger than himself. So all the people he did were older than himself, and they're all slowly dying off. And
Sure.
it wasn't the fact that he couldn't do the voices. It felt wrong when somebody who was 56 was doing, you know, the young up and coming comedians of the era, and comedy had changed anyway. And so I thought, right, I've got to find for when Mrs. Thatcher goes, because his career was very damaged when Wilson resigned and Ted Heath disappeared and Callahan was beaten by Mrs. Thatcher.
Yeah.
And so he was very nice to me. I loved working with him and stuff. But I sort of realized that when I got to, I had to find a different job to do when Mrs. Thatcher came to an end. And I had, I'd very luckily been taught a trade, which was puppeteering. And so for about 7 or 8 years, that's all I did. I worked in children's television. I did loads and loads of shows, and people felt probably, I don't know what people felt, but perhaps they felt, oh, Paul, he's fallen on hard times, you know, after Mrs. Thatcher went and Spitting Image had come to an end. That actually wasn't true because I worked on a series called several series called Crazy Cottage. I did one called House of Gristle. I did another called Spooks of Bottle Bay, and these were, you know, popular children's programs of the. I did one called The Wild Bunch, which we made in Paris. So I just was constantly working, but the one that I was the most successful financially was a series called Cat's Eyes, where I played a cat called Jimmy the Cat. Does this ringing bells?
Yes. Yes.
So if you were ill with a bad cold and had to stay at home,
Yes.
they were on often for an hour. You know, you could watch 3 or 4 of these together. Roland Riveron was in it. And
now I'm remembering. He's great. I like him. Didn't he do a sitcom? Didn't he do an interview thing where it was all in water once?
We made 40 shows.
Wow.
We made 40 shows, very short shows, but for various technical reasons, contractual reasons, that we got paid every time it went out. and sometimes they would go out, put 4 out in one day, and then they would put them through the night. And Roland said to me, he came home one evening. What was the expression? He came home one evening tired and emotional, and he switched on the television set, and there he was with the cats. But he knew he was going to get paid, so that financially was very good for me, actually. And it allowed me to do some teaching because I had this automatic income. So that's how I ended up doing some teaching, which I didn't get paid hardly anything for. But Cat's Eyes was great fun, and I stopped doing that because I got older and it just became more difficult to operate the puppets. I did recently work on Dark Crystal.
The new series.
The new series. Yeah. And that was great because I knew all the puppeteers. Yeah. I became oddly enough friendlier with the puppeteers than I often did with the voice artists, but that's partly because of the way you work as much as anything else. The voice artists you'd see once a week, but the puppeteers you'd see 5 or 6 every day for 5 or 6 days, whatever. So I became very close to the puppeteers. So I enjoyed Dark Crystal. And there was one day where I was brought in to operate cables, so I never had to pick anything up because the puppets were very heavy. I operated eyes and things like that. And the reason I got the job was because they were making Star Wars at the time, and lots of puppeteers went over to Star Wars, and they were pretty desperate. And my name was on the list somewhere, and I got this phone call saying, do you want to work? Can you come in for Dark Crystal? I said, yeah, tomorrow, Friday. Well, no, now, get in. And because they needed somebody that day, and then it went well. So they said, can you come in tomorrow? So I ended up working on it quite a lot, and that was great because I just liked all the puppeteers. That I just knew them all. We'd worked together over the years so much. And I really like puppeteers. The reason why I like puppeteers, their ego is between here and here. Oh. That's where their ego is. They have no ego here. They're not interested in being famous. Yeah. They're not interested in themselves. They care about the puppets, potentially too much sometimes, get slightly obsessive about the puppets. But their ego is in the performance of the hand. Quick story. That I worked with John Thurtle, a wonderful puppeteer, and his partner Ian Allen, nice, lovely guy, and they made a series called Button Moon, which you may
love that show. Yeah,
they were Button Moon, classic children's television, and they also made Spooks of Bottle Bay. Anyway. So I was chatting to John one day in the studio, and they'd been together for 25 years as a couple, and I said, 25 years, it's a long time. I said, did you ever, he said, that it's not terrible, but as soon as it's alive. So that's what we learned on Spitting Image, always to have the puppet looking at something and focusing. And I think there was an actor, a ventriloquist, who did a character, I think called Lenny the Lion. I can't remember, before my time.
Yeah, I remember.
But he, and the thing about his eyes was, I think this used to squirt water out. That was the fun part or something like that. I can't remember. And he as soon as he left his dressing room with Lenny, it was alive for the children. Even if it was backstage, it was alive, and he kept up the illusion. That I have worked with ventriloquists who don't do that. I know. And they when they need to record, they lift up the puppet and just do it. He didn't, and I have huge respect for that. And that's the thing about the puppeteers. They going back to their way of thinking. It's very, very much the illusion of making something that is actually two golf balls on a bit of fur alive, and and believing in it and making it live. And it's a real skill. And I was never that great at it. I could do it, but there was some. We had a puppeteer called Anthony Asbury, and Anthony did Mrs. Thatcher. And we had one sketch where Mrs. Thatcher was by then dressed in a suit, and we had her in a gents' toilet between two guys, and so there were two guys were there, and then Mrs. Thatcher came in, and there's nothing below the waist, below the top of the suit. There was nothing below there. But Anthony's skill as a puppeteer made it look as if she was getting her big member out. She was holding it. Yes. Then she put it back. Oh no! Then she gave it a shake, and then she put it back, and then she readjusted it, all with the top half of the body. Yeah. And that was genius. That's where the skill of just moving it slightly to create this world that doesn't actually exist below is a real skill. I never had that. I mean, I can make the white cat focus and the Jimmy the cat. Jimmy the cat was a sort of this sort of scouser, and they would talk like that. And my fellow cat was William Todd Jones, and he was from Wales, so he did sort of Welsh one. And I years ago, I did an audition. I was in charge of an audition, a workshop for a film, and everybody was about 22, 23, and they said to me, "So what? Steve, what have you done?" And I said, "Oh, I did Spitting Image," which they'd never heard of. And then I mentioned Cat's Eyes, and of course, they knew Cat's Eyes because that was the generation that had watched Cat's Eyes. So, and occasionally I get letters or emails asking, about it, and it was a very happy show to work on. Actually, it was very good. Worked with Joan Sims was on it, but I didn't actually get a chance to work with her because unfortunately she injured herself after the show and couldn't do it. And then they had Dora Bryan came in to replace Joan, and then Dora Bryan sadly had to leave, and then Janet Brown came in. So I had a great opportunity of working with people like Dora Bryan, who was lovely, and Janet, who I knew, and of course Janet had done Mrs. Thatcher herself well before I did Mrs. Thatcher, and back in the 70s. Yes, and we got on very well actually. So that was, I think people felt that we hated each other, but we didn't. And why would we?
Well, there's always that thing, isn't it? When impressionists meet in a room, do they all go quiet because your Brucey might be better than my Brucey, or Steve?
It's also there is an element of that, but there's also an element of if you've got a voice that you are particularly good at, and nobody else does it. I mean, the one impression that impressionists get me to do is actually Joan Hickson as Miss Marple, because nobody else does it.
Oh yeah.
So how does she go? Oh, Chief Inspector. Yes, I was rather worried about where the sherry was. You see, that was where they put the arsenic. Oh, I was very foolish. But now I know who did it. I shall tell them. And my impression is like that because it's a tiny voice, you see. So with I don't know, people like John Cole, the political commentator from years ago. The Prime Minister today announced that in Parliament she intended to, and frankly, most people could have a go at that because there's a lot to have a go at. Oh, but you see, there's so little with Joan Hickson. It's so slight, you see. And that is a little diamond of a voice. And I quite like it because it's a fun, it's a fun voice to do. You can't make it funny. It's very difficult to make it funny in the same way that you can with John Cole or something. And I've never done it really professionally. I don't think I've ever used it.
And AI is the thing now, isn't it? That they do this thing. Sorry to interrupt. They do this thing now where they'll have like Trump and Obama and Biden all in a room playing Fortnite, and they use these AI voices, and it's kind of good, but it lacks the timing. It doesn't feel like a real person doing it. And just then, I've not seen anybody do that before, and you're right. And that was Miss Marple. That was like, oh, you could do audiobooks, you know.
Well, I think I do intend to put her as a character in an audiobook. That's sort of where professionally now. When I worked with Dora Bryan, I never really did an impression of Dora Bryan, but when I then did the puppet show called Spooks of Bottle Bay, there was a character called Lily who ran the boarding house, and I based it on. Oh, my heart! I get there. Oh, my heart's pounding. Oh, it's not a very good Dora Bryan impression, but it was the basis for Lily, that particular character. So, and so I sort of the characters I've done, male and female, that aren't very good as impersonations, can then be used for audiobooks. Charlie
Hickson was saying that.
Well, I don't know. There's I do a sort of Alec Guinness. It's not particularly good, but I mean it's a useful voice to have.
Yes.
The Sun people are easily frightened. It's not a terrible impression, but it's not. I think one of my best. But actually, this voice, if you just do it like that, is engaging and interesting. And I sort of want to be able to use that as an audiobook sort of character when it's a character. So that's I'm gone to jail by the looks of it, because the sun's coming out.
You've got a bit of film noir now, haven't you?
I've got a bit noir. Film noir, yes. Yes, Venetian blinds and film noir. So I'm wearing my Doctor Who hat there, as you can see.
I was going to say, if they ever bought Margaret Thatcher, they've done time travel. Either, you never know, they'll go to the 80s and they'll wheel out Margaret Thatcher or something like that. And you're talking about, the lights is giving you some very interesting effects.
I can see the postage stamp in the corner of the screen. I'm tiny, but you're big. That's great. But
hello. I was going to say, when you talked about voices becoming other voices, Charlie Hickson, he did of the Far Show fame, his very strange car selling character, whose name completely escapes me, I can't remember now. It's not Polish Tony, but it's somebody, Swiss Tony. And he said, actually, if you listen very carefully, it's a very bad Sean Connery, but it evolved into that character, you know. And that's what can happen with voices. I have a comedy show myself, Comedy Lover's Guide, and I occasionally play my own agent, who is a very, very bad sort of. It's a Brucey, but it's exaggerated, and it's that thing of going, well, if I can't use this voice to be exactly what I want it to be, I can use it for something else.
Absolutely. And I've never been able to prove this, because I've never been able to name the original director. But there was a story that Mel Blanc, who did Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and all those characters, met up with Laurence Olivier as you know, people do occasionally meet up by accident. And each of them was saying, where did you get your voice for whichever character? And the subject of Daffy Duck came up, and the subject of Richard III came up. And it turned out that they both based their voices for Richard III on Daffy Duck on the same person, who was this vile director that they had met or worked with. Now, their voices are very different between... now is the winter of our discontent made glorious and all that sort of stuff, and Daffy Duck. But you can just hear that there is the nastiness of Daffy Duck. You know, Bugs Bunny isn't nasty, and Daffy is. and flapping, stamping over. I can't do it. Other people are better at those sort of things than I am. But yes, anyway, the sort of origins of voices are, and then there's the alien in is it Family Guy or the American Dad? Which one? Family Guy. Is is it American Dad? Which we know
he's like that, isn't he? So
yeah, he's based on Paul Lynde, who was Seth what's the name? Based it on Paul Lynde, who used to be in Bewitched, and
he's great. Yeah.
So on. So I do a character from Bewitched, and again, I've never used this professionally, which is Aunt Clara. There's the bumbling.
Oh, Tabitha. Fortunately, it's slightly gone wrong. Oh, Samantha, I'm so sorry.
So but
I love you.
She might get
official voices with.
Well, one day I might use it for something. I don't know what, but I'll get it used. But no,
Alec Guinness is an engaging voice, and if you don't make it sound like Alec Guinness, but just somebody who's talking, then it's enough different from your own voice. And so I think I have used that in an audiobook. But anyway.
So your next when you're talking about books. I'll probably get the time travel book. I thought it was the third one, but it says it's the second one.
It's complicated. So we happen to have here one we prepared earlier, as they say. So this is the history of time travel.
Destination time travel.
Yeah. Destination time travel. Now I've written this with Dick Fiddy of the British Film Institute. So this is a book which is really for time travel fans. In fact, we dedicated it to time travel fans, past, present, and future. And it's got chapters such as time machines, portals, passages, and gateways, time windows, time threads, time loops, time causal loops, paradoxes of time, stories and plots, rules of time, time codes, dreams, foretelling. So it's very, very much the science of time, the philosophy of time, the appeal of time. So that's very much a sort of a history of time travel in mainly film and television. We don't really cover novels because there's too many of them, except my own, which is called The Time That Never Was. So what happened was I wrote this. I had an idea for a time travel story because I had what's it called? Urinary tract infection. Very unpleasant, which meant that it's a urine, and basically you get bacteria in your bladder, and you just have to wash it out. So you don't sleep for a week until it's sorted. So you drink lots of cranberry juice, which often enough gets rid of it. But so for a week I didn't sleep, and then you begin to hallucinate, and then you begin to go a bit bonkers. And in the middle of the night I went a bit bonkers, and I came up with an idea. But and the idea really was based on something that happened previously, which was I'd come home and a tile fell off the roof of my house and just missed me.
Ooh.
And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a creature, a being, some sort of being that knew that was about to happen and had stopped me in the street for 15 seconds in order to avoid the accident happening. In order to avoid me being hit by the tile. To avoid the bad timing. So that they nudge you out the way and push you out the way. You go, why did you do that? And then you get to where you intended to go, and then just before you get there, the thing falls and it saves your life. The fact that there's been an intervention. Yeah. And I love the idea of tiny interventions. So most time travel stories are huge things, and I just love. Then let's concentrate on the small, and how small things can change in a big way. And then I had created a character which I wanted to do in stand-up, which was a ghost character from the Victorian age, and I had done it in stand-up. but it meant dressing up and stuff, and it had worked very well, and I'd toured it, but I couldn't get anybody to produce it. So I got all the jokes for this character, which is loosely based on my grandmother. So I then made the grandmother the mentor for the boy. So instead of having
Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan Kenobi, or
whoever it is, Dumbledore or whatever, I thought, why are they always grey men in grey beards? Why can't we have a Yorkshire woman? So the mentor is loosely based on my own grandmother. So this book came out a couple of years ago, at the time that never was. The sequel is out, I think, in March. It's proofed and all that sort of stuff. But I don't think it's gone to the printers yet as we're talking. But of course, somebody may be listening to this in 2025. So this is all old news, assuming that 2025 happens. We just who knows? And absolutely, who knows? and touch wood. I'm going to get very superstitious now and do the whole touch wood business.
Find some wood to touch.
What was I going to say? So when I wrote this, I realized that I had to decide what my time travel rules were for the story. I had the story, but then I had to work out the rules. And then I thought, well, other people will have done this. So I started making a list of Back to the Future for my own benefit, and then I wrote it up and put it on the internet. And then the publisher said, no, put it in a book, because that's will be. So it then became months and months, if not years, of work putting it all together in a book. So it's fairly comprehensive, but the problem with not really a problem, but the thing about time travel stories is there's hundreds of them. And we've covered what we could, but the stuff that out there that that we haven't managed to see. Dick was great because Dick said, look, this shouldn't be just the standard stuff like the Time Machine and stuff. We have to look at Goodnight Sweetheart. We have to look at Family Guy. We have to look at the series he was very fond of called Time Wasters. So we have to look at sitcom and sketches and really, not Back to the Future is great, but we really should try to cover these other stories too. And then a friend of mine's big into horror. He said, oh, but there's horror ones. There's Triangle, this time loop horror thing set on a boat, which I'd never heard of. So then I got hold of Triangle. So it was very expensive, getting all the DVDs and all the rest of it. And then I discovered 2 Korean time travel, each of which were very, very long. And then there was the German one called Dark, and which is a brilliant time travel story. I think probably the best of its generation. But of course, it just takes a long time to watch all this stuff and make notes on it. But so anyway, we got the book out, and and now I'm got to write part 3 of the time travel story, which is the first one was called The Time That Never Was. The second one's called The Time They Saved Tomorrow, and I think the third one is called The Time of Yesterday's Return. So
that's good. Like a Bond movie.
Yes, it does sound like a Bond. In fact, somebody said it sounded like a Bond movie. And actually, therein lies the plot, because the essential concept is that the world that we are now living in was only ever a temporary world created by somebody in a time loop, and if that time loop isn't kept going, our world collapses, because really the Germans won the war, and that should be the default option. So Granny and William have to essentially make sure that our world, which is only a possible world, continues and becomes a permanent world. So that is big stakes.
It's a great concept. It's like a sort of a temporal placeholder. I like that. It's interesting.
Yeah, we are. That's the idea that we've only ever been since 1945. What was your phrase? A temporal placeholder. I like that, because that's exactly what we are. And it's fairly fanciful, but and again, there's the way it works is it's the small things that made the difference.
So that's interesting, because like Nigel Planer has a time travel thing out, Jeremiah Born in Time. And when I was discussing it with him, he was saying, you haven't had the same idea at the same time, don't worry. But he's had that thing of little mementos that you touch causes you to jump. And I said, oh, like the Christopher Reeve movie. And he went, what movie is that? And I said, oh, you're going to have to look it up. And he was like, oh, no, have I accidentally seen something yonks ago and borrowed it? But I think that's the wonderful thing about being creative, is you can cherry pick little bits and create your own thing. You don't just I saw a thing, you know.
Sorry, the interesting thing, for example, about Somewhere in Time, which is the Christopher Reeve story, is that there's no time machine. He sits in a hotel room and thinks himself into the past.
Yeah.
So I decided that with The Time That Never Was, I thought, well, is there going to be a time machine? And I didn't want to have a time machine because I didn't want to make it science fiction in that science sense. And so I've got him what I call he's a swidger. Originally, he was going to be called a nudger, but somebody said that means erection in America, so you'd never sell in America. A nudger is an erection, so probably not the best title for a book. So so I called him Swidgers, which is based on a Charles Dickens. It's not my name. It's Charles Dickens. It's in a story called The Haunted Man.
Okay.
Anyway, he one of his Christmas stories. But yeah, I wanted very much the it to be a creature that, or the Swidgers are people that can see get a sense of the accident in the future. More importantly, it's time that decides. So in my world, time is an entity. It's almost like not quite a living creature, but it's got a sentience, and it decides who can travel with it. So they don't travel in time, they travel with time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, not heard that before.
And again, I needed a way of getting him in. So nobody's ever done this, I don't think. So I looked at a load of philosophy. I read a load of philosophy.
Sorry.
Oh, right. And I came across Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel. And he was a bit bonkers, but he and most of his philosophy is impenetrable. But he came up with the idea of thinking yourself out of time.
Yeah.
By negating the now, by negating the nature of the past becoming the future, the past becoming the future, and the future becoming and the present becoming the future. Negate those things, rise above time.
Wow.
And then you will be able to experience the whole of time in one moment. And I thought that was so sort of psychedelic and weird and stuff.
Interesting.
So that's how I've described it in this book, that somehow Granny and William, particularly William, thinks himself out of time, thinks himself out of the now, into this realm of permanent existence across eternity. And that allows him to fly into the past. And I won't bore you with the whole story, but there are basically 7 things that happened that stopped Britain winning the war. And if those things now do happen, then the war will be won. But they're trapped in this time loop. So I've got to solve all that in book. I sort of know what a few of them are.
Yeah.
One of them, for example, because it's in the book coming out, so I can talk about it. And I'm not very precious about revealing plot stuff. But one of them is based on I went to Dungeness for a holiday, which is an odd place to go, but it's a beautiful place in its own way. It's spa. It's very strange, like another planet. It's where Doctor Who often films their other planet stuff at Dungeness. Pure shingle. And you've got the nuclear power station in the background. So I discovered that in the war, there was an ice cream factory in the middle of Dungeness.
Yeah.
A weird place where they made ice cream, except it wasn't anything of the sort. It was actually a pumping plant, because the Allies had laid a pipe underneath the channel, which was to get petrol and oil across the channel for D-Day, because they knew that all the Germans had to do, all the Nazis had to do, was bomb the ships carrying oil across the English Channel, and that would mean that the Allies couldn't get any further than Cherbourg or whatever.
Yeah.
So but of course it had to be secret. So the code names were Dumbo, Pluto, and Bambi, which is great, just isn't it great?
Yeah.
And eventually, of course, they got a foothold in France, and they didn't need the pipeline anymore. But the ice cream factory had been built as a counter, camouflage.
Yeah.
In order to hide the fact that it was actually pumping petrol across the English Channel. But supposing the Germans had discovered that this was not really an ice cream factory or an ice cream parlor and bombed it, then that would have had big implications for the war. Yeah. So what happens in the story, and it's revealing one of the plot moments, but there we are. All Granny and William have to do is eat ice cream outside the factory, lick their ice cream, and the German reconnaissance plane flies over, sees them licking the ice cream, and it's clearly an ice cream factory, because Granny and William are licking ice cream outside an ice cream factory. Yeah. Therefore, they don't bomb it, and therefore Britain wins the war. So it's the small, tiny little things like that. Just eating ice cream saved the world.
I like that, like doing a nice thing for yourself. Actually,
and it's fun, and children will like ice cream. So the idea that ice cream, and actually, of course, in the story there is no ice cream. So what they use is spuds, mashed potato that looks like ice cream.
Of course. But they didn't get it. You couldn't get it in the war. They
couldn't get ice cream because in the middle of Dungeness, the irony was there was no ice cream. So, but they had to make it look like ice cream. So they ate mashed potatoes, which I discovered is what most advertisers used advertising ice cream anyway, because you put ice cream under the lights, it melts. Yeah. So back in the 70s, and I don't think it happens now because the different laws. But all the ice cream back in the 1970s on advertisements on television was actually mashed potato.
You learn so much stuff.
So all these little things you remember, and then you put them in, and then I added a flake, a Cadbury's flake, and then I thought that can't be right. Would there have been flakes in 1943 or whenever I've set it? Yeah. And so the great thing about the internet, you go on the internet and you say, surely the flake must have been discovered in 1962 or something. No, it came from 1933 or whenever it was. So it pre-existed the war. I was thrilled about that, because that meant that that's one thing that was real, was the chocolate flake.
Well, I still don't know why it's called a 99, because it was never 99p.
I found that out, and I've now forgotten why. There is actually a specific reason.
Yeah.
And I think what it was, the actual flake was that when they're in the process of making chocolate, little bits of thread comes off at the side, and they're just laying there at the side, and would have been sort of thrown out or whatever. And the guy said, let's get all those bits of flaky threads that are wasted and glue them together with some, not glue, but obviously some chocolate, and we'll make a confectionery flake bar out of them. And that's actually what happened. So, but there is a reason why they're called 99, and I think it's something to do with the Italians. And anyway, so that's something to look up.
This just feels like Alan Bennett would be talking about that. Oh, I can't do an Alan Bennett, but him talking about you never find out why it's called a 99. I've asked my friends, I don't know.
So well, it's something to do with the Italians, and I can't remember what it is, but I don't think that got put in the book. There's a terrible pun about chocks away that did get put in the book, you know. So, but at the moment, you know, the writing, I've never had an original idea in my head, in the sense that it didn't come from life.
Yeah,
I did a talk last night, and someone said, you know, where do you, the writing process, how does it work? I said, everything I've written is based on something that had happened, something that somebody had said to me, something that very rarely is it something I've thought of. Now, with the urinary tract infection and going a bit mental in my head, it was very unpleasant, but at the same time, the idea came to me. But that was based on the as I say, the slate falling and just missing me. I mean, it was a hell of a round. And the guy who came to fix the roof said he would have killed you. He said, no, he said, look at the size of it. You know, it's the size of a television screen, some of the slates. I live in a Edwardian house, and the slates is huge. He said, the original slates, they're very heavy, they're very sharp. That's the nature of slate. It's sharp. And it wouldn't have chopped your head off, but it would have cut into your skull and you'd have been dead.
We wouldn't be having this conversation.
We wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yes.
But that's the point, isn't it? You know, that life, and then I did some research about tiles falling. Yeah. And then I discovered that Ben-Hur is based on a tile falling. What happens is there's a parade going by, including some very senior Roman dignitaries. A tile falls from a roof. It crashes, upsets the horse. I think the dignitary or somebody falls off.
Yeah.
They accuse the people in the house of being subversives.
Oh.
Ben is, I think, the son. He then gets taken into slavery.
It's all little bits.
It's like all that. From. Wow. So the technical phrase is catalyst event. That's sort of how stories begin. They begin, and so that story, the whole of Ben-Hur, which is God knows how long it lasts, it begins. It's not the inciting incident as such. I think that's slightly different, but it's the catalyst event that starts the whole process. The catalyst event that creates the disequilibrium within the story that then leads to the inciting incident with the character. Essentially, he's arrested or put into jail and turned into a slave, and of course his destiny and freedom is to get out of that situation. So that's your, as it were, your inciting incident. But the catalyst event is often an accident like that. So my catalyst event was the urinary tract infection that kept me awake. So
I want to say a happy accident, but it's more like an unhappy accident. It's that thing of going, well, out of something unpleasant, you get inspired from a nightmare, or you get a moment in life of going, I didn't do that, but I'll do something else, you know.
But here's the thing: you've got to the antennae have to be there for the story So people, I think, can have ideas coming at them all the time, but unless you then take that idea. So I've also been working on some ghost stories.
Yeah.
Which are not official yet, but I can reveal one of them.
Okay.
And that is, so I wanted to write ghost stories. I always liked ghosts, like time travel. So when I was a kid, in 1910, in 1970, and then there'd be Doctor Who, there'd be the Tomorrow People, there'd be Catweasel about a wizard, there'd be episodes of Star Trek that had time travel in. So there was another one with which is going through a fence and going into traveling in time. There's loads of time travel stories. There are also lots of ghost stories, some of them quite comic, like Randall and Hopkirk. And then on films that I liked, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, and there was Noel Coward's Bly Spirit. So I'd always been fascinated by and The Ghost of Motley Hall, which is a sort of version of the Ghost on BBC One that they have now. So, but I'd always been interested in ghosts, so I always wanted to write ghost stories. So a friend of mine was staying with me. So this becomes a bed, this thing. So he comes and stays with me. He's an actor from Cornwall, and he stays with me when he's working in London. So in my bathroom above the toilet, I have Kenneth Williams. You see, I have a picture of Kenneth Williams. I have all the carry-ons. So I've got Kenneth Williams. I've got Frankie Howard. Oh, yes, yes, Mrs. I've got Charles Hawtrey, who I can't do. And I've also got wonderful Hattie Jakes.
Yeah.
So Adam came down one day after using the bathroom. He said, you're going to have to move her. I said, what do you mean you're going to have to? What are you talking about? He's one of those people who says things like that without explaining. And he said, you're going to have to move her. I said, what are you talking about? He said, you're going to have to move Hattie. I said, why? He said, because I can't go. Because
looking at me.
She keeps looking at me.
Yeah, I was getting it as well.
And
it's
not that she just, not only does she look at me when I'm using, when I'm standing there.
Yes.
But even when I'm washing my hands, she just, So I thought it was very funny.
Yes.
I said, no, I'm not going to move her. So, and then I thought, supposing Hattie in the picture was a ghost.
Yeah.
Or somehow her spirit had come into the picture itself. Yeah. And I thought, okay, well, how would that happen? So we'd need two people who are fans of the carry-ons. And then I loosely based it on two gay guys I knew that were bears, very, very large bears.
Oh, yes.
And they were fans of the carry-ons. And they loved men and food, which suited Hattie Jakes, who loved men and food. And I mean that, in the best possible sense of celebration of life. So I then came up with a story where Hattie Jakes haunts their downstairs toilet.
It's nice. Yeah.
And I thought, well, how then do I tell this story? Because I need a narrator. And then, of course, well, you see, it's very obvious who's going to come back from beyond and tell the story. What, of course, we can. So the story is called Visiting Hattie. Oh. And I think it was the first ghost story I wrote.
Yeah.
And since then, I've written 10 or 9 others. I'm on number 11 at the moment.
Yes.
Which I've been writing today, and there's another one. So we're thinking of calling the collection The Darling Deadly Dozen, because some of them are quite camp and some of them are horrific. So it's a whole range of and each one of them is its own ghost story, in the sense that one of them is a Christmas ghost story.
Yeah.
One of them's a theatre ghost story. One of them's a revenge ghost story. And they've each got their own. One of them's an armchair ghost story, a story within a story. Because I read about 200 ghost stories, mainly Victorian and Edwardian, and one of them's an M.R. James ghost story. For fans of M.R. James. So I read all of M.R. James, and all of E.F. Jensen as well, because E.F. Benson I think is my favourite ghost storyteller writer. And so there's a mixture of fun and horror and there's one that's a redemption one. It's a redemption ghost story, but it's a Christmas ghost story that features 2 angels. There's not really any ghosts in it, but I want to do a homage to Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life. So yes. that is that. So that's my big project for 2024. So of course, if you're watching in 2025, it may or may not have come out, and if it's come out, it sold 4 copies and then died, on its arse or whatever. You never know. Or Netflix are making it into a series. So
see that. Yeah, well, with Inside Number 9 and similar things, people do like a good spooky tale that's
Yeah,
slightly.
Inside Number 9 is interesting because Inside Number 9 is very genre based.
Yeah.
It's very aware of itself, and I like that. It's great. I have tried to, with the M.L. James story, I've tried to make it an M.L. James story, as if M.L. James could have written it. So it's not a parody or a pastiche. It's very much tried to be as real. And several people have. There was one I wrote called For the Hell of It. It was a good title. I've never ever used that. Somebody wrote a film called Just for the Hell of It.
Yeah.
But I came up with this title For the Hell of It, which is a real horror story, loosely based on a film called, not loosely based, but I sort of realized I watched a horror film, several horror films recently. One was called Cocaine Bear, which I loved.
I've not seen that. It's a good,
And another one was called Where Evil Lurks, and there was a one called Talk to Me. And often these stories are basically 5 ways of killing people in an interesting way. So the way to write a horror story, I've decided this is, horror fans will probably hate this, but there's an element of truth in it, and that is find 5 or 6 different ways to kill somebody and put them in a plot.
Yes, I suppose, like Final Destination. I've been watching those silly 2000 movies, and it's like watching the beginning of Casualties, just strung out. You know, it's like a bit more gruesome, obviously. Yes.
Well, I won't detail one of the deaths, but I did send it to a friend of mine, this particular death. And I said, what do you think of this? And he said, Adam, it was the same guy who likes visiting Hattie. He said, Steve, are you all right?
Yes, I'm fine. It is very scary. But thank you so much for sharing lots with me.
Well, yes, you've got an exclusive there to a degree. I did I did a Carry On event last night. So I did talk about it there. So it's sort of slowly getting out into the ether that it exists.
My wife did a Carry On thing called Carry On Cthulhu, which was set in an imagined group who were the what's it called, the Getaway Crew. It was a sort of spoof of Carry On, and it was set where there was a Hattie Jacques and Kenneth Williams character in a LARP, live action role play environment. And I'm sure I can say it because they ran it about 3 times. And I got to write a sub Carry On horror script for it, which was lovely. And to see them, people sitting around and reading it out, was a joy. But mixing horror and Carry On, I think there's a Frankie Howard one, isn't there? I can't remember what it's called now. He does there's a horror movie that he did.
Yeah, well, there's a few. I think he did a couple. But actually, if you watch Carry On Screaming, it's a very good horror story, and the monster is actually very good. And Bernard Bresslaw as the sort of butler character is quite frightening, and it's a genuinely, it's got Harry Corbett in it, Harry H. Corbett. Sid James didn't do it, but and it's the wonderful Fenella Fielding and who smokes, who does the smoking gag, and Kenneth Williams had one of his many catchphrases came from Carry On Screaming, which was "Frying tonight."
Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to watch these now.
They're great. I really enjoy them. I haven't seen them for years, and but because I was writing the Hattie Jacques one, I watched all the Carry Ons, including Carry On Emmanuel, and I never got as far as Columbus, but I nearly said Columbo. That would be interesting. Carry On Columbo, but there are people who really like, there are fans of Carry On, not just Carry On Clear and Carry On Camping, but there are fans now that genuinely like, Carry On Emmanuel. It was the only one that never made money, which is why the series was
I've tried to watch it. It's too naughty. It's like a confessions movie. It's there's not much charm to it. I like the TV shows. They kind of work.
Yes, no, I obviously enough, my favourites are the early ones. I like Carry On Teacher and Carry On Constable and Carry On Sergeant, the ones that were made in black and white. I've got very fond memories of those. So anyway, yes. So there we are. The wonderful Hattie. There she is. And we shall see. It's nothing's in this world, nothing's ever set in stone. There's always things that can happen, but we live in hope. And 9 of them are written. 10 of them are written, and who knows? Maybe somebody will actually get a chance to read them one day. We hope so.
Well, I will definitely read them, and I hope so, because they sound like sort of stuff I'd be intrigued by, and you definitely sold it to me. And
talking of selling, there's one. There's one.
And there's a third one coming.
Never knowingly undersold. There's the books, folks.
Oh, and I shall thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I shall